Hello and welcome to another episode of Idioms of Normality, hosted by Traces.Dreams and Future Framed TV. Today, I am with an exceptional individual because normally when I ask the question, what is normal? A lot of people say to me, "Oh, Paul, I'm not the expert on that question." But I have found an expert who has co-authored this fantastic book published by the University of Chicago Press called Normality, a critical genealogy, co-authored by Peter Cryle and Elizabeth Stevens. This wonderful academic tome is probably the comprehensive academic guide to the history of this concept. Associate Professor Elizabeth Stevens, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm thrilled to be here, Paul.
Before I jump in with the first question, what brought you to co-authoring a book about an academic volume on normality?
Paul, the image on the front cover of that book is a clue to the answer to that question. I did spend 5 years of my life full-time researching the history of normality. Why would anyone do that? The cover of your book, the cover of the book that you just showed there, is an image from a photograph taken by one of the inventors of the word normality. His name's Francis Galton, and amongst other things, he's the inventor of the idea of normal distribution in statistics. And he took this photograph as part of his research on the idea of the normal to mean average, the statistical idea of normality. But notice all the faces on there are cut out of the image. That's because what he was doing with those photographs is actually combining them into composite images in a time when photography itself is very new. This is the late 1800s. And so he superimposed images of family groups one on the other to find the normal distribution of facial types amongst types of people. He was an anthropologist. So that image is a waste product. That's the thing that he threw away when he had finished doing his work. But now, of course, it's in the archives. But to me, that is the perfect representation of the idea of normality, that it's a blank space. And so the reason that we came to look at the idea of normality is that, as you said yourself, in introducing this, today's topic, normally we do this and then you laugh because we use the word normal all the time. And yet the word normal is this blank space. What's in there? So for me, that's why I spent 5 years of my life working on a long history of the normal, because we talk about the normal all the time. We use it in everyday conversation 1,000,000 times a day. And yet when someone says, "What do you mean by that word?" there's this long pause while we think of all the different things we could be referring to and which one am I thinking about at the present moment. That to me was a fascinating thing, a word that is in popular usage all of the time, but none of us actually know what it means. That for me makes it a really powerful cultural term. So that's how I came to write the book.
Yeah, there's power in ambiguity, isn't there? And you're preempting one of my questions, which was, why was the front cover this photograph of 5 individuals, all with square boxes that had been cut out where their faces were, and that description was very insightful because the faces on these bodies could be any face, and obviously we're filling it with these notions of normality, which is nefarious and ambiguous, but I'm perhaps interpreting it with my own lens as well. Let me ask you your interpretation and your discoveries through 5 years of research on normality. What is normal?
Well, I will tell you one thing that I've discovered is that the more we are interested in the term what is normal, the more in crisis our sense of the normal is. It's a really interesting and quite unique aspect to the cultural history, if I can put it that way, of the idea of the normal, that there are periods of time in which people are not obsessed with what the normal is. And there are periods in which it comes into a spike of usage. So I thought my work was done when I finished that book. It came out at the beginning of 2018. And I thought, that's it. I spent a long time working on this. Time to move on to other things. And then the US election happened, the last one. We're about to have another one now. And there was this massive spike in particularly the phrase, this is not normal, and the hashtag not normal came into use to talk about the previous American election campaign. And I thought, that's inconvenient. I'm finishing my book now. I'm done with this topic. But all of a sudden, there was this huge discussion in the public sphere, mostly in the States, but of course everywhere else, about when can we allow these things to be understood in the political sphere as normal or not. Then shortly after that, we had that hellish season of bushfires in Australia, where all of a sudden everyone was saying, is this our new normal? Is this what it means to be living in the middle of a climate emergency? And I thought, here this word is back again. Now, of course, we find ourselves in the middle of a pandemic in which everyone's saying, when are things going to go back to normal? They just want things to go back to normal. Or they're saying, the old normal was the problem. We need a new normal, or we need to do away with the idea of the normal. In each of these moments, as in the book that we wrote together, what we noticed is there are these moments in which people feel like the ground has disappeared from out of their feet, that the things that they took for granted, what we might think of as ordinary life, or in fact the bounds of what is possible and what is acceptable, what we can tolerate, what we can adapt to. These are all very common synonyms for people talking about the normal. The moment that people feel like they're dissolving around them, you will find a spike in the use of the word normal. So I can tell you from the book, the first time that the word normal is a word that we use in everyday language, because until quite recently, it was a word that only doctors or statisticians used. It was not a popular word that people would use in everyday discussion. And the moment that people start talking about the normal, not what is normal, who is the question of the 20th century, is as the Second World War is ending. Why would that be? And the discussion around the normal then is particularly around what is a normal young man and woman. It's a discussion that's coming out of America at that time. But in particular, it's what is a normal woman? Because women, of course, had just spent, depending where they lived, up to 5 years suddenly being what were called war workers. And so suddenly you had women who are doing everything. They're working in factories, they're the journalists, they're in all the offices, they're doing manual labour. Everything is being run by women because men are all off being, mobilised and being soldiers, mostly overseas. And then there's this moment in 1945 when you have to invent the modern housewife and you have to convince women to get out of the workplace and back into the domestic sphere. That moment, there is this huge discussion to the point of having a national competition to find the most normal women in the US. And that is the moment when the normal comes into everyday talk. When we ask ourselves what is normal is because we think the normal is in crisis.
When we find people asking what is normal, it sounds like a very objective question. It sounds like a very scientific question. But it seems like there's a second half of that question which is being left unsaid, which is, what is the normal we want? And I was very taken in something you wrote where you said you describe normal not as a standard, but as a system. Can you describe a little bit about what normality is when you're talking about normality as a system, not as a set of standards?
Yeah, the idea of a normal as a standard is probably one that most people are familiar with, or at least can think about. So then normal is one thing, and you have a template, and then you can identify what is normal. But if we think of normal as a system, it becomes something that we are all measuring ourselves against. So wherever we are, ugly, not normal, or if we are defining ourselves or thinking ourselves against the normal because we understand that in fact as a hostile or oppressive or repressive term, even so we are in the space of normality. And so then the normal becomes a way of measuring us and our differences from the normal, because of course none of us are perfectly normal, are we? That was Freud, the psychoanalyst. Great insight was that he actually said, I love this quote, that he is greatly increasing the number of the perverse, he said, because he was showing that there was no such thing as normality. And then Kinsey, the great sex researcher from the middle of the last century, said the same thing. He said the idea of the normal, it's a mirage, it's a complete fantasy, and a very damaging one, he said. We are all on a spectrum. And so if we think of the normal as a system, then it becomes, if you like, a form of orientation, that there are these very powerful cultural ideas about what norms are that we're not free to just completely disregard, because they work in culture, whether we don't like them or whether we oppose them or not. They're still there and active agents. So then we occupy a space around those, and it's in that way that it operates as a system. We're all inside the space of the normal, even if we're defined or define ourselves as being opposed to it or against it.
I'm particularly enamored and captured by this idea of normality as a system, because it situates normality within concepts such as patriarchy or meritocracies. And there's a realm of normality which the system will, a range of normality, shall we say, that the system will tolerate. And then there are outliers which the system either doesn't tolerate or can recalibrate the system. You were talking about, Kinsey was a really fascinating researcher, and he brought a whole raft of different things to the table that Freud didn't. One was the fact that his research was based on surveys, but you also pointed out the critical moment that normality is becoming a popular concept in popular language, and that was after the Second World War, and where people were recalibrating society. I've spent the last year working at a zoo, and what's really interesting is that zookeepers were predominantly male until the Second World War, and then from the Second World War, at our zoo at least, the majority of zookeepers since the Second World War. So these critical events can shift the dynamics, but then also, you look at the distribution of salaries and how much people are getting paid, and you can also see how that is calibrated within a system that recognises certain forms of normality, and that can also be equated with inequalities. Can you tell me how normality plays into power dynamics?
That's a really rich and complicated question. Obviously, you've touched on some ideas around gender there, and there's been a whole series of moves around that. Like, one of the kind of case studies that people are interested in at the moment is the way that up until and just after the Second World War, and this was a subject of the recent film Hidden Figures, of course, the women who were running the show in terms of computer, the women, because it was the people who were called computers in those days. So the early computers are all women. They're all, early female mathematicians. And when computers become a technology that's on everyone's desk, it switches and becomes all male. So you see these various moments, where those dynamics change. But the one that's really striking to me, obviously we can talk a lot, I think a lot about the role of gender in this, but the one that I think is less visible and really urgent at the moment is the intersections and non-intersections between race and ideas of normality. So almost when the word normality comes into sort of widespread use, after the Second World War, it replaces a phrase that we don't hear anymore, and that is people used to refer to, in the US context, they used to refer to native white Americans. What native white meant is second generation or more Americans. So Americans were there was a strong eugenicist movement that was against mass immigration, sounding like familiar stories, aren't they? So there was an anti-immigration movement, especially people coming in from like the east of Europe, but any non-English speaking European countries. There was a strong move against that. And so the native white was the phrase that people used to mean the kind of Americans that they approved of, properly white Americans. But the word normal, as it comes into everyday use, replaces the word native white American. So a normal American American, as that word starts being used in the middle of the 20th century, actually means white. And it's a way of erasing the cultural specificity of the term white. And so one of the things that's come out really, especially since the 2016 American election and into the present day, is that you have a massive social upheaval across all these different sectors in terms of the climate emergency, in terms of now the pandemic, in terms of the rise of populism, where you hear people say a lot, this is not normal, we can't normalize what's happening now, the new normal is awful, we have to work on this. And against that rhetoric, you have a whole bunch of voices of people who are Black, who are Indigenous, who are people of colour saying, welcome to our normal, because this is what it's been like for us since colonisation, since enforced slavery, and so on. And so that's one of the dynamics, I think, that's really important to foreground at the moment, that when you have a large population of people who are grieving and terrified about the loss of normality in their lives, especially during the pandemic, which is a thing that's happening now, people are really unnerved to agree that we haven't seen before on such a global level. But there are other voices saying, this has been my history, or the history of where I come from, for centuries sometimes now. So I think that's important to remember as well, the hidden racialization of the idea of the normal.
I want to get onto the new normal and the next normal and not normal very soon, but I want to ask at least one more question about the hidden racialized history here, because I think, when you say something like native white, it's a concept that's very visibly racist. You can point your finger at it. But the term normality filters through the hegemony in a way that makes it harder to point at a single factor. It's harder to point at the psychometric test that you had to do to get the job, because it seems scientific on the surface. It seems like it was objective. But if you really trace, as your book does, the concept of normality to its roots, it was a term which was used as a form of political statecraft to establish the superiority of the normal Frenchman over the normal Indigenous person. And even though the scientific vocabulary seems to be one that is comfortable for scientists and doctors, it has a very gritty, ugly history. For me, that just returns it to the concept of it's become a system. It's not just a concept. It's not just a standard. It's something that has filtered through the system. And in some ways, the concept of normality seems like it wasn't normal for the entire population of the planet. It was normal for rich, educated, white men. Like, it didn't even, in the first instance, it doesn't seem to be a concept that was across all people. It was a concept that was applied as a way of moralizing other people to be like us. You're nodding your head, so it sounds like I'm prompting you in a way that you actually agree with.
Yeah, that's exactly the purpose of the word normal, to seem bland, to seem innocuous, to seem objective, to seem scientific. And thereby it disguises everything that goes behind those. So, for instance, if you think of the idea of the normal, in terms of the concept of normal distribution in statistics forever, then you're talking about numbers. Well, how much more objective do you get than numbers? But how are you getting those numbers? How are they being acquired? There's all these stories behind those. So, one of my favourite examples of how the idea of the normal implements itself in ways that are both very regimented but look completely invisible in terms of the decision being made is the history of how we come to have standardized clothing sizes, for instance. So, in the 19th century and early 20th century, people are obsessed with collecting large sets of anthropometrics, measurements of human bodies. And one of the kind of early purposes that they're put to is to make uniforms for soldiers in the first place, because you've got to make a whole bunch of those very quickly, starting with the American Civil War, but also then in the First World War. They had to make all of those uniforms, like millions at that point, really quickly in standard sizes. How are you going to do that? You measure people and you decide how to, like, what are the basic measurements for each body. So women, again, come along a little bit after that. And there is a movement during the Depression. There are all these make work exercises where the government hired and trained a whole bunch of women to take anthropometrics from the general population. And then the idea was they would take all these measurements, there were charts and everything on how to do it, and they would come up with what we now know as standardized clothing sizes, which didn't exist back in those days. But what they did, so there was this huge call out, and people could go to their local YWCA and volunteer to be measured, and everyone did it. They'd all go together, and it was like a nice afternoon out for everyone. So off they would go in their community groups to do this. But then the people who wrote the report on how to do this said, oh, well, if women came along who weren't white, then for the good feeling in the community, they would collect their measurements as well, and then they would just quietly throw them away without telling anyone afterwards. So they silently only collected the metrics of white women, and it's white women's measurements that then were used to create standardized clothing sizes, and every other ethnic category was just thrown out as being outside of the statistical averages that they were collecting. Those, when you look at how the numbers are collected, all of the stories are like that.
Wow. It just seems like a way of systematizing passive aggression.
Well, they were very polite about it. Oh, sure, come in, we'll measure you too. But there was no question that they were going to see that as relevant data to their, and statisticians will come up with a reason why that's so, that different ethnic types have different shaped bodies, and so it will mess up the data set if we just put them all in together. Of course, it's not hard to critique that kind of logic, but that's what they would have said. We're not being racist, we're just being good statisticians, they would have said, and did say.
I'm not sure if I'm putting on a really good poker face right now, but my blood is boiling listening to this. How are you reacting when you're doing this research? How does this feel for you? What reactions do you have?
There is a certain satisfaction in making visible power dynamics that have long been invisible. Do people know that standard clothing sizes actually are working within a very small pool of what is standard? Anyone who doesn't fit those clothing sizes knows. And in fact, you can see changes in that now. So that, for instance, when women are buying bathing suits, now if they're two-piece bathing suits, you buy them separately. You tend not to buy them as a set anymore because most people don't fit into the norms of on their tops and bottoms. So you can see changes in that. For me,
I'm going to pretend like I didn't know that.
What for me was satisfying about doing this work was to make visible dynamics that have been completely invisible. Because one of the things that I've noticed, and we know if we're just using the word normal in a kind of everyday context as well, it is one of those words that we use all the time. So it's everywhere. It's everywhere in our sort of popular language. But whenever you try and say precise, specify, pin down exactly what it is that you're talking about, it's like it disappears and it vanishes and it's hard to pin down. For me, like, they're the most culturally powerful words, and they're the ones that you want to watch out for. So if you can pin that word down and say, here, this is the work that this word is doing, this is the cultural dynamics and the cultural networks in which this word is embedded in right this moment, and make them visible, there's something resistant and there's something powerful about making visible something that wants to hide itself.
Making visible those hidden structures resonates really strongly with me, particularly because that's another way of paraphrasing my impetus for having these conversations. By questioning the status quo, by questioning normality, we can uncover the hidden agendas. And in some ways, there is a little bit of a hidden agenda when you look disdainfully at someone else and say, that's not normal. Because you're saying, well, my sense of normality is more important than their sense of normality. When you moralize people with the word normality, not you, but when people moralize other people, when groups moralize other groups, there's an imposition of one group's standards upon another group's standards, but it's masked by that lovely, oh, we did a survey on this. We're not going to tell you about the methodology that we used. We did a survey. It looks nice on the surface. It sounds all beautiful. Moving on, though, I wanted to ask you about the new normal and the next normal. This is, one of the biggest hashtags that you'll see at the moment. I think it's the hashtag of 2020. Not normal, new normal, next normal. How do you feel about this hashtag, and where do you feel the conversation needs to go?
Yeah, I think that's such a good example because it's one that really resonates. If we look at some like older examples and like they kind of psychiatrize the idea of what the normal is and the obsession with who, is normal, because that was a question everyone was asking, last century, doctor, am I normal? Even people like Kinsey, who was like a proponent against, he wanted to throw out the idea of the normal and then was completely inundated with letters from people saying, tell me, am I normal or not? But now, so I find that fascinating that, normal was an idea that was an attribute of people, and now it's an attribute of culture. So I'm completely obsessed with that shift that's taken place, at the beginning of this century there. But one of the things that I find salutary, as someone who wrote a long history of the normal, is to be in a moment in which the normal is in such crisis, because you can't be academic about that. Like, it's happening to all of us. And there are moments where, I'm sure you do too, like, and I find myself thinking, like, I'm done with the disruption of this pandemic. Like, this is awful. Everything in my life, has been cancelled or affected or ruined. And I want to see my family. I want to see my friends. Think of Melburnians who have just spent 8 months, 8 months in a continuous lockdown. Like, what is important to me is to recognize how deeply rooted in us and how important the idea of normality as we're using it now is. Like, people really do want to feel like there is ground beneath their feet. And the way that people are using the word normal at the moment, and the normal that they want, is a sense that the world has not gone insane. Like, you see all these jokes at the moment. I've been collecting, the internet memes around the normal, around the sort of disruptions of time. Like, next week was so exhausting, like these sort of tenses, mixed up, and or jokes like, what next? And you'll see like the aliens landing on Earth. The sense that the limits of what is possible are gone in a way that is truly terrifying for a lot of people. Like, what happens when the whole world is thrown out of work simultaneously? That's far beyond anyone can imagine with the Great Depression. So for me, it's important to take seriously how embedded and how important the idea of the normal is, and not sort of dismiss it as something that is a kind of, a passe idea, an idea that we can kind of move along, because look at the conversations that we're having now. But at the same time, it's really important, I think, to recognize that the voices, mostly non-white voices, that are telling us this has been our experience for a long time. I think that's a really important thing to sit with, because rather than making judgments about other people or how you sit, in relation to other people in a kind of voluntaristic way, to recognize that, in fact, our sense of grieving how our lives were before is a sign of an enormous privilege, and that the word normal marks a privilege that someone like me has been the beneficiary of, for a long time, that has not been, that other people have not been, other populations have not been. I think that's a really important moment to sit with, I think.
What's really interesting about the word normality and normal being really popular during moments of crisis and high uncertainty is that we also see that in big data that you can collect online. So if you look at the Google Ngram viewer, you can see moments of uncertainty in history, and the popular usage of the word normality actually rises alongside periods of conflict, war, epidemic, and how people, particularly politicians, capitalize on the idea of returning people to normal, a return to normal. And we're seeing that in the UK, we're seeing that in the US. And there's a lot of people desiring a return to normal. My reaction to that, and I'm using my reaction as a prompt to hear your thoughts. My reaction when I see people wanting a return to normal is, what? You want us to return to the ignorance that led to land mismanagement that led to the 2020 Australian bushfires? What? You want a return to the ignorance of deforestation, increasing urbanisation, overcrowded human settlements, as well as increasingly dense wildlife, and this human wildlife conflict or interactions that give rise to zoonotic diseases that then spread across the world. There is no return to normal because those are the outcomes of that normality. The zoonotic disease becoming a pandemic, the bushfires raging out of control. That is the flux of this normality. And my reaction to that is we need to have a conversation about normality.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you. And there's been, a lot of writing recently and a lot of sort of widespread public sentiment that what people perceived of as the normal until whenever you want to date that, let's say in Australia it might be the big fires, of last summer. So let's say for a large percentage of the Australian population, that might be the point in which, and especially when, because our Prime Minister said this is the new normal. So that was a moment, and that was widely reported all over the world. So that was a moment where I think people started to think, no, the new normal and the old normal are terrible. Like they suck. Let's think about how we can do things differently. So there's been a huge reevaluation of the normal recently, and that's important. I mean, I absolutely agree with you that it needs to be done. And extractive capitalism it's unsustainable apart from anything else. I mean, one of the big kind of trends that you can see, starting with the kind of early managerialism beginning of the last century, is the obsession with quantified productivity, which is another part of this history. And a lot of people are saying the more dynamic of extractive capitalism, of hyper productivity, is unsustainable. And we've reached a point at which we've extracted all there is to extract. People are burning out, land is burning, we have a pandemic. It's clear that the status quo, if we can use that as one synonym for the normal, how the ordinary life that we had before is awful and needs to be done away with. I think a lot of people are probably in agreement with that, except the beneficiaries of extractive capitalism. And it's interesting how much that's becoming a shrinking group. That's the one positive, of this moment, is that we are seeing, large solar farms being installed really against the wishes of our current government, or at least against their interests or their idea of where our economic and environmental future can be. So we're seeing some massive changes around that. So these are all, I think, needed and positive, and the change in so many people's work in terms of either they're working from home or they're currently not working, and thinking about what the future of work might look like. We were all thinking about the future of work and automation, and here we are in a pandemic. So there's lots of people, I think, thinking about this, which of course, is both necessary because it's happening and positive in a lot of ways. But the thing that I'll say, as someone who's been looking at the history of the normal since the word came into use in the context of medical discourse at the end of the 1700s, is that many times people have pronounced the end of the idea of the normal, that it's become whatever they think the normal was, however it was functioning, the work that it was doing in their cultures. There's been many moments in which people have said this is a redundant cultural concept, it's outlived its purposefulness, and it may in fact be, different people at different times have thought that it was a negative concept. So in the 1960s, with the countercultural movement, lots of people were against the idea of the normal and letting their fruit flag fly and so on. You have all these moments in which people pronounce the end of the normal, and this is one of those moments, but it's always in the context of people talking more than ever about what the normal is. And that, I think, the end of the normal is always the beginning of, it's always the moment of a spike of discussion of the normal. And so far, every time people have thought the history of the normal has come to a definitive end, let's do away with this horrible concept, it's the moment in which it's more powerful than ever.
It's fascinating how robust the concept of normality is, as flawed as it is, because the concept is epistemologically flawed. If we are to be strict philosophers, you can't even get agreement on what normality is by so-called experts. And more to the point, the data doesn't actually support the idea that there is something called the normal. It was a misappropriation of astronomical mathematics in the first place. But nonetheless, culturally, as a very young concept, because it is quite a young concept in the history of humankind, and it's a concept that's quite ethnocentric too, but nonetheless that has been very invasive to the languages of non-English and non-French and non-Germanic language groups around the world. So it's an incredibly robust concept once it invades a vocabulary. And yet it bleeds so strongly into all these other areas. We can hide our agendas in it. We can actually think we know what we're talking about when really we don't. It's shorthand for concepts that we actually haven't really put the cognitive effort into. And one place where I find conversation about normality runs into a bit of difficulty is when we start talking about the conflation of normality and the ideal. Normal on one hand seems very bland and boring, but then on the other hand, being normal is almost an ideal. How do we make sense of the conflation between normality and the ideal?
Yeah, it's so interesting. It comes because of the convergence of two different ways of thinking about the normal. So, on the one hand, the normal, in terms of how it's used in medicine, doesn't mean a kind of standard or a template for the perfectly operating body or biology. It just means one that works, one that's alive and is functioning in a more or less healthy fashion. So one sort of synonym for the normal is the healthy, and that just means it's not actively dysfunctioning, it doesn't have any active disease, it's working okay. But again, that's a systemic definition. So for instance, your heart wouldn't have to be the perfect shape of a heart, for a woman or for a man of your particular type. It just has to work in relation to all the other bits of your body. That's what normal means in a medical sense. But on the other hand, you have this idea of the normal as being the average, the peak of normal distribution, for instance. And a lot of the blurring happens because those two words fuse together. And the moment that they do is you can actually pinpoint it, which is quite unusual historically, is the moment where I mentioned that at the end of the Second World War, there was a competition to find the most normal woman in America. It wasn't actually the first of those. There were typical family competitions before that. But in terms of the normal, there was this moment where they had the clothing sizes that I mentioned. They took all the data of all the measurements of tens of thousands of young, mostly white, of course, American women's bodies. And then they took a composite of the averages of every bit, the arms, the legs, and so on. And they made these two statues, one called Norma, who was the woman, and one called Norman, who was the man. And they put them on display in the first public health museum in America. And the male body sort of got forgot about, immediately. But they had this competition to see who had the perfect measurements, who would be the living embodiment of Norma. There she is.
Is that them there?
Winner, Martha Skidmore, who is the winner next to her statue there. In fact, what they discovered is exactly what you just said, which is that no woman actually matched the dimensions of the statue because the average woman is an ideal. And someone did try to, the person who was running the Natural History Museum at the time, did try and explain this to the general public, how an ideal could also be an average. Like, so possible. And what he said was that, of course, no one can be perfectly average. Just like Freud said, no one could be perfectly normal. So you could be like more or less like the most average of your kind, and you could come closest, but no one in every dimension was going to be perfectly average. It's the ideal representation and it always has to be representation because there's no embodiment of an average that is perfectly average in all of its measurements and capacities, but no human is ever going to embody that. That's in fact the reason why, to go back to the cover of the book, why Francis Galton, who took that photo, cut out the heads and combined faces together, because he wasn't interested in individuals. He was interested in types, in perfect types. And he said no individual person will be the perfect type of the upper class English gentleman or the Irish fisherwoman or whatever type he was interested in looking at. To get the perfectly average type, he said there is no living embodiment of these. He had to create an ideal representation. So that is, in fact, sleight of hand at the center of the concept of normality, that it's a mythical ideal average that no one can ever measure up to, and that's why it functions so well systemically, because if any of us fit into it as a standard, it would be a simple definition, a template that we could follow or not follow. But it's much more capacious than that.
It seems to fall into the post-industrial cognitive trap of wanting to pigeonhole, our obsession with closed systems, because a normal study that way is only ever going to capture a moment in time, even if it was something real. But we know that species change, populations change over time, and we know that there's no type when it comes to a different species. And yet that obsession with finding the normal bleeds into so many different areas of what we would call the natural sciences. But there's a flaw in the philosophical mindset, our approach to these things, which seems to bleed into so many different endeavours. And in some places, I think it's been quite successful. It's been successful in the marketplace. It's been very successful for branding and design and for marketing and for selling products. It's been successful to a degree. You can read Seth Godin and Malcolm Gladwell saying that, no, actually, we need to embrace diversity if we want to sell products. We need to not just have the one pasta jar. We need to have a selection of different flavours, because the marketplace is a diverse, variegated patchwork of individuals and groups. And yet normality persists.
Yeah, you see this in a lot of sectors at the moment. Like, look at things like the rise of phrases like neurodiversity, for instance, which are intended to be much more inclusive, phrases to take account of the fact that people's brains work differently. And so that's one of the areas, and we see this, in terms of gender diversity as well. But, neurodiversity, I think, is really a sort of new area where the concept of diversity is very specifically there to undo some of the damage done by very normative models of, for instance, how people's brains work in a whole range, of different capacities. But nonetheless, like if you know anyone or you yourself have been through the experience of realizing that you yourself are neurodiverse in whatever area that might be, the level of comfort that people take and the extent to which they're reassured by having a diagnosis that explains their particular area of neurodiversity. So, okay, like I have a diagnosis that I'm on the autism spectrum that I got as an adult, and now my life makes sense. Like all these challenges that I've been having, like we would all know, or many of us have had that experience ourselves of having that moment of, now I have a narrative that makes sense of my kind of diversity. In a sense, there we see like these normative models. Like, I'm just a normal autistic person, as it turns out. So the extent to which diversity itself also allows for normative models to be imported, and the extent to which people really do want to make sense of the world around them. And normal is one of the words that people use for something that makes sense.
It sounds like you're describing why the concept of normality seems to be so robust, because it seems to absorb a new range of normality. Neurodiversity, well, that fits within, we're gonna recruit that and put it into a new pool that we call that new pool normal. And I guess one of my fears, and I should justify or explain where I'm coming from with this fear, because I worked in neuroscience for several years before becoming an anthropologist, and contributed to conversations in neuroanthropology. And one of the fascinating things that I found when I was working in neuroscience was that neuropathology does not always map or correlate one-to-one with behavioural output. And the other way around, you could have behavioural anomalies that did not map to any neuropathology. And sometimes in the same condition, you could have people with Alzheimer's pathology but no behavioural complaints. And then you can have someone with Alzheimer's behavioural pathology but no neural evidence of pathology. So when you've got this flawed concept of normality hovering above this, and you're trying to understand how this can be, when you're filtering the data, you're naturally filtering the data through this concept of normality, and then discovering it's wrong, and then we have conversations on another level about neurodiversity. But that conversation in some ways, and in some very powerful ways too, is a reaction to normality, I sometimes wonder if the epistemological foundations of neurodiversity as a reaction to normality are on pretty rocky ground, because actually we need to revisit the flawed thinking behind the whole thing rather than just getting frustrated with the edifice of normality that has been constructed to date. I think the building materials need to be questioned, and I think we're struggling to question the building materials, whether those building materials are cognitive or scientific or political.
It's an ongoing problem. There's lots of areas like in gender studies, in queer and sexuality studies, in race studies, where people have been trenchantly opposed for very good reasons to the idea of the normal, and then have based whole areas of research and political activism and social activism around an opposition, to the idea of the normal. But then what happens is exactly the kind of dynamic that you've just pointed out, that in constructing a relation of opposition, then you are centering conceptually the very thing that you are trying to critique and embedding it all the more strongly in your epistemological or your framework for thinking. It's one of the reasons why I say the idea of the normal works systematically rather than in terms of standards, because it's a dynamic, that works across these kinds of areas. I think the use of the word diversity was an attempt to get away from terms like non-normative or anormative or atypical or any of the other words that people are using, precisely to get rid of that conceptual centrality. But I mean, I think one of the things that I think about is that there are two sort of possible strategies when you have a term that you're critical of. So one of them is to oppose it, to have a kind of polemical attitude towards it. The normal's an awful idea. I want to get rid of it. I want the whole idea, needs to be opposed. But the other way is to problematize that idea and say, well, critiquing it seems to center it all the more strongly in the debates that we're having. But what if we problematize that idea instead of taking opposing strategies? Say, why is it that it remains so central despite the fact that we keep critiquing it? That, I think, is the only the sort of line that remains to us, to say, why is it in a moment of crisis that we keep coming back to this term? What is it that makes it so central? And what is it that allows it to change so much across time as well at the moment? At the moment, when people are using the word normal, it's much more refer to the ordinary, or to the status quo. But there's also, the word normal is also being used to refer to things like sane and stable. Like when people say the world does not feel normal at the moment, what they mean is that it feels like the world is a cuckoo clock that sprung a spring somewhere and it's like a dysfunctioning machine at the moment. To recognize the extent to which people can't cope with that level of instability, I think that tells us something about why the normal is being used. Maybe we can use some better words for that. But I think rather than rushing to critique the normal, we need to understand the conditions that make it so important to people.
We need to understand the conditions that make it so important to people before we can critique it. That's a really insightful idea to bring forward as we think about the next normal, the new normal, or even a return to normal, if we entertain that spine-tingling idea.
Despite our best efforts.
Yeah, despite our best efforts. Moving forward, what questions should we be asking about normality?
I think the question that people always asked, last century, was always who was normal. So there were a lot of judgments about who was normal, who got to count as normal. And there was great damage done to people on the basis of being excluded from the realm of the normal. Now we're asking, what is normal? So I think that we can see that there's a shift in the terms in which people are understanding the normal. And so I think going forward, some of the questions that we might ask are, for whom are things normal? So like, who's normal? Rather than who is normal, whose normal are we referring to here? So, we have a lot of challenges in this country, in Australia, across a whole range of sectors. In terms of the immediate outcome of the pandemic, that might be what's in people's sort of mind at the moment. We have a looming climate catastrophe that is on its way as well. And then, of course, we have a long unresolved and largely unkind of accepted that we even need to take account of this. The legacy of colonisation, in this country is something that a lot of Australians still won't even contemplate thinking about. So one of the things that I think it's important for people to ask is, who's normal? When people are using the word normal, who is it that's using it, and for whom are these things normal? So the hope that I have is that rather than the normal being this vague word that's both everywhere, in our popular language, but no one bothers to specify what it means. So look at any newspaper at the moment and you will see hundreds of references to the normal in all its different, contexts at the moment, but it's never, ever, ever defined. So I think the challenge for all of us is when we see this word come up in conversation, say, whose normal is this? To whom does the normal belong here?
When I hear that in my head, I'm saying, whose normal is being favoured and whose normal is being listened to, and recognising that there are a variety of normals. And that was a really interesting point that you made, that previously the question being asked was, who is normal? But we've decentered the concept of normality from a person or an individual and distributed it throughout a system. And we're starting to ask, what is normal? What is normal for the system? And we now need to disrupt that form of interrogation and start asking whose normality is being favoured in the way in which this discourse is being rolled out.
I think that's so true. And I would caution everyone, and I'm saying this to myself as well, to think that it's an easy concept to do away with, partly because of the history that I was sort of gesturing towards as well. But I also think when we respond to the election in America is going to happen in about 10 days time, there are moments like that when you see something happening so outside the bounds of the normal. And I feel like you and I might be on the same page about this, where you think that's not okay. It's not acceptable. It's not tolerable. So there are moments in which each of us will discover that we have an investment in a particular kind of idea of the normal that really we are passionately attached to in ways that are being challenged at the moment. So imagining that we can just sort of dismiss the idea of the normal. Oh, we're in favor of the non-normal or the anti-normal. I grew up in an environment where people were really opposed to the normal and proudly, so. And then you see a moment of this where you think, no, not okay, not tolerable, not acceptable. That's not a normal thing that the American political system and the rest of us, should have to tolerate or be able to adapt to. And that idea of what we can adapt to is one of the things that we use the word normal to refer to. So I remind myself not to be too smug about my relationship to the normal, as though it can be done away with, because I know in myself that I have lines of what can be tolerated that are being challenged right now. And so it's instructive for me to remember that.
And I think on a very practical level, for me, I feel like that's a much more fruitful conversation about what can we adapt to, what can we tolerate, what are we willing to change? Because then we're putting really concrete ideas on the table. We're saying, I can tolerate 6 days a week without seeing another physical person, but I need I need 1 day a week of something, some physical contact or a conversation face to face, or I'm making up things, but there's practical conversations we can have once we get people to be precise with their vocabulary.
I absolutely agree with you. And I guess what I would suggest is, we've talked about some of the complications baked into the idea of diversity and using that as a kind of more positive replacement category, to displace the role of the normal. But you just used a bunch of words that are much more useful that we can use to displace the idea of the normal, that won't reproduce those kinds of oppositional dynamics. Sustainability is one of those. Adaptability is one of those. What we can tolerate is one of those. These are all terms. Acceptable is a term that you see in American discourse a lot. We don't use that term in the same way in Australia quite so much. But especially sustainability and adaptability, they're two words that don't come with the baggage of those sort of oppositional categories that say what it is that we're usually referring to these days.
Sounds like we need to build up a conceptual toolkit to arm ourselves for productive conversations.
Indeed, we do.
Associate Professor Elizabeth Stevens, thank you so much for joining us today. Your book is an exceptional academic tome on this subject, but you, of course, are still working on it, and it's still very relevant. You're still publishing pieces, I think 2 already on this topic this year.
It's hard to escape.
And thank you so much for spending your time with us today to share your answers and your views and your perspectives on what is normal.
Thanks so much, Paul. Real pleasure talking to you.